When we think of China today, it is simply unimaginable to even consider the nation ever participating in democratic reform, at least for the time being, with the Communist Party of China holding such a tight iron control of the nation. And with the vast majority of business people, celebrities, and other notable figures of China more than visibly showing their staunch support to the leadership of the Communist Party of China in such a uniform fashion, it is hard to once again even conceive the idea of the ordinary people of China protesting against the regime in demand for democratic reforms, at least on a massive organized scale. But only 3 decades ago, this was not the case. In June of 1989, the People's Republic of China was closest it has ever been to becoming a democratic nation ever since the nation's founding in 1949. But we all know how the political tides of the nation has turned since then. So then the question has to be asked, why did the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989 fail to achieve its desired goal of democratic reforms in the People's Republic of China? This video will answer this specific question in depth, and by not just focusing on recent events that are shown on the current news, and by not forgetting our history, we can also have a better grasp of what the political future of China will be, with the Politburo of the current CCP being fundamentally unchanged in its core party ideology from the one they possessed during the time of the Tiananmen protests. The Tiananmen Square protests was one of the largest student movements in the history of the country of China, and it began with the death of Hu Yaobang on April 15, 1989. Hu, widely regarded as a reformer within the Communist Party of China, had been purged from the Central Committee after his perceived mismanagement of student protests for democracy in 1986. With his death, thousands of grieving students poured into Tiananmen Square to mourn and eulogize a leader who many had hoped would reform the CCP. Soon, the thousands of mourners turned their anger against the government. On April 18th, the students submitted a petition of 7 demands to the Chinese government. The government's refusal to officially accept or respond to the petition angered the students, who began further protests. Then, on April 26, 1989, the government-sponsored People's Daily published an article entitled "Uphold the Flag to clearly oppose any turmoil," accusing the students of inciting civil unrest. Enraged, the students continued their protests, spreading them to other cities in China. Then, in May, students began a hunger strike and a sit-in in Tiananmen Square, forcing the CCP to move the welcoming ceremony of Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev to the airport, a diplomatic embarrassment for the Chinese government. A dialogue between CCP leaders and student representatives on May 18th ended in large discord. Then, on May 30th, the students erected the most lasting symbol of their movement, their quote-unquote goddess of democracy, a papier-mâché statue in the style of the Statue of Liberty. The Chinese government, desperate to end the protests before death among the hunger strikers occurred, forcefully retook Tiananmen Square on June 4, 1989, with an estimated death toll of anywhere between 400 to 800 civilians. And so ended China's largest pro-democracy movement in the modern era. The failure of the Tiananmen Square protests is clear. The students achieved none of their 7 demands, and thousands were arrested or fled the country to escape prosecution. Zhao Ziyang, the reformist general secretary of CCP, was relieved of all official positions and confined to house arrest until his death in 2005. The CCP enacted absolutely no democratic reforms as a result of the demonstrations. And to avoid future instability like Tiananmen, China stopped political reform in its tracks as the party purged itself of all elements that may be considered liberal and democratic. The removal of Zhao Ziyang from power essentially condemned the remnants of Chinese democracy movement and left the government to be ran by conservative elders who had supported the June 4th martial law takeover in Tiananmen. And as you can probably already imagine at this point, with Tiananmen, debates about democracy in the CCP were ended and the question of political reform became absolutely taboo. In the words of Time magazine in 1989, to quote, "The hardliners won." Now, if there was to be any type of silver lining from the protests, it would have been in the generation of civilian sympathy within China, which could act as a potential precedent for future democratic movements. But even this seems to have failed, as according to an anonymous Chinese businessman who interviewed with the New York Times, to quote, "People don't talk much about June 4th, and we don't even think about it too much now. Nobody wants chaos here." Before we discuss as to why the protests failed to achieve even the slightest of democratic reforms in China, we first have to discuss whether democratic reforms in China was even ever possible in the first place. So let us place the Tiananmen Square protests in the context of the political environment of the decade. Deng Xiaoping, who returned to power in China in 1978 as the nation's paramount leader, advocated greater freedom of speech for the people of China. However, the irony of this was that once the Communist Party began to be openly chastised by the people, the freedom of speech movement was quickly suppressed by the government. So, at first glance, this supposed quote-unquote freedom of speech in which the CCP advocated was not much of freedom of speech at all, as one was only allowed to speak freely as long as they did not criticize the CCP. So, in some sense, one could raise the point that in reality, democratic reforms were never feasible in the first place in Communist China, regardless of how much Deng Xiaoping attempted to preach on the surface of a quote-unquote more freer China that was different from the previous Mao era. As while China did attempt to embrace a more open and capitalistic economic atmosphere after decades of economic catastrophe during the Mao era, the core political ideology running through the key members of the CCP never altered. But for the student protesters as well as the rest of the Chinese population who aspired for democratic reforms in the country, there was one figure of hope within the CCP, and that was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, Zhao Ziyang. By 1989, when the Tiananmen protests occurred, Zhao was already widely perceived within China as the voice of reform in the party and was the reform's quote-unquote greatest hope. And in hindsight, he was indeed the closest thing to the greatest hope in which China have had until today for a potential democratic reform, as some of the speeches and actions in which Zhao conducted at the presence of nation's paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, is simply unimaginable in the atmosphere of today's CCP, tightly controlled by the unparalleled authority of Xi Jinping. Some of the notable actions in which Zhao took in the direction of enhanced levels of democratic elements in the nation are one such as his open advocacy for limiting the power of the central government. For example, in the 13th CCP National Congress in 1987, he made bold statements in front of Deng Xiaoping and the rest of the party members as in how, to quote, political reform in China is increasingly urgent, and that the party has to quote-unquote listen attentively to the view of the masses in order to build a quote-unquote socialist democracy. So while Zhao Ziyang by no means intended a full-fledged democracy for China, we can see how he was one of the key upper members within the CCP who were willing to listen to the voices of the protesters who were seeking democratic reforms for the nation. And some historians even go on to claim that the only reason as to why the student protesters in Tiananmen was not quote-unquote cleared by the Chinese army despite Deng Xiaoping's wish to do so all the way back from the April of 1989 was due to Zhao Ziyang's presence within the Politburo of the CCP and his support for a more soft-handed approach towards the student protesters. He even went on to declare that their demands were, to quote, just demands that must be met. So although the protesters in Tiananmen were eventually cleared by the People's Liberation Army on June 4th of 1989, leaving an estimated casualty toll of several hundred, there was indeed a glimpse of hope for open dialogue, especially during the initial phases of the protests between the student protesters and the CCP. Despite how Yer Kai-shi, a political commentator, described the protests as, to quote, one of the most rational and well-organized and remarkable movements of all time in human history. In reality, student leaders of the protests faced trouble controlling a very unruly movement that increasingly gained a life of its own as time progressed to the side of radicalism. We have to remember the fact that Tiananmen protests of 1989 did not begin as a movement demanding democratic reforms, but to mourn for the death of Hu Yaobang, a pro-reform high-ranking official of the CCP. So as a result of the spontaneous nature of the protests, the students lacked a unified leadership. Representing the students was very difficult for the lack of unified political motives or a concrete vision of what the nation of China ultimately should be. A planned press conference on May 24th, for example, was cancelled after disagreements among the students occurred over whether or not to demand Premier Li Peng's resignation. Perhaps Chahua Wang, one of the protest leaders, said it best, to quote, "We didn't have enough intellectual preparation to make meaningful demands. We had no plan." In many ways, the hunger strike on May 13th was the beginning of radicalization in the movement. With some 3,000 students enthusiastically participating, the Provisional Federation of Beijing University students could do nothing but to give its blessing to the movement in order to maintain their legitimacy as the leaders of the movement. However, not every one of the protesters supported such a radicalization of the movement. While the moderate students continued to attempt dialogue with the government, this was made increasingly difficult by the hunger strikes from the radical students, whom the CCP perceived with much bitterness as Gorbachev, General Secretary of Soviet Union at the time, was arriving in Beijing only in a matter of a few days. And in hindsight, the transition of the movement to that of radicalism, one of the biggest downfalls of the movement, and why not even one of the initial student demands were even considered to be met by the CCP. Liu Kai-shi said that while the former moderate phase of the movement had a well-defined plan of action and concrete objectives, the latter radical phase of the movement did not. And with the hunger strikes becoming ever more confrontational by the day, and some even calling for the removal of the permanent leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, from power, the protesters paradoxically moved further and further away from democratic reforms. This is as the CCP obviously had no intentions to further condone a decidedly anti-government protest to continue within their capital, hence the regrettable decision to clear the Tiananmen Square through armed means. All of this is more than unfortunate, as the radicalization of the movement was partly due to the party's constant ignoring of the student protests and how they denied its legitimacy, while continuing to regard it as mere, to quote, premeditated and organized turmoil with anti-party and anti-socialist motives, especially by the Conservative Party members such as Li Peng, who strictly refused to negotiate with the Tiananmen protesters until the very end. And with student protesters getting more and more angry by the actions of Li Peng and other Conservative Party officials, on May 29th, they erected the famous Goddess of Democracy statue in the middle of Tiananmen Square, directly confronting the portrait of Mao Zedong located in Tiananmen Square. And this overt symbol of democracy, which very much resembled the Statue of Liberty, was perhaps the last straw for the CCP, as an armed takeover that we all know of occurred just days later. What has happened in China since 1989? While the USSR dissolved, the People's Republic of China very much remains. Since Tiananmen, China's remarkable economic reform have transformed the country into an economic superpower, fighting the number 1 and 2 spot between the United States in terms of national nominal GDP. And perhaps China's very successes with their uniquely Chinese version of the market economy is what brought the apparent political apathy that prevails throughout the current younger generation of the Chinese people. And with the Communist Party of China arguably having even a tighter grip over its population compared to back in 1989, if democratic reforms were not feasible in the nation during this earlier period, it seems very likely that the chances of such reforms look even more grim now. But whether or not the protests impacted the course of China's history, and in broader context, the modern history of the world, if we imagine the type of butterfly effect in which the slightest of democratic reform was to have occurred back in 1989, the tragedy of Tiananmen cannot be ignored and forgotten, or just lightly be remembered as a topic of a meme by the people of the younger generation talking about minus social credits and whatnot. Alright everyone, that is it for tonight. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and share us your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you guys as always for watching.